Welcome. My name is Baki Tezcan. I teach history at the University of California in Davis, and I'm the convener of the virtual panel series that we call What's Up in Ottoman and Turkish Studies, or What's Up for short. This is the 10th one of it. What's Up is brought to you by the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association and with the technical support of the University of California in Davis. I'm extremely happy to introduce a great panel today, and I owe a lot of thanks for that panel, especially to my colleague and longtime friend, Christine Philliou, who teaches history at the University of California in Berkeley. She and I get a chance to talk every once in a while because we happen to live in the same town. So she was telling me how this is the 200th anniversary of the Greek Revolution, and she was involved in a panel at the Delphi Economic Forum. So I thought we should also contribute to the commemoration of the Greek Revolution as the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. And so she was kind enough to bring the people back together again. And today you'll see them. Next month on September 10th, we have another What's Up meeting, this time with Janissaries in Ottoman port cities, Muslim financial and political networks in the early modern Mediterranean. The chair will be Ioannis from Crete, from Retimna, and I hope you can join us. Today, I'm going to pass the ball to introduce the panel to my senior colleague, Molly Greene, and we have something that we say in Turkish, bu işin kitabını yazmış. So, you know, she wrote the book on this, Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. As you can see, she wrote 3 books about Greeks on the Ottoman Empire: A Shared World, Christians and Muslims in the Early Modern Mediterranean, Catholic Pirates and Greek Merchants, A Maritime History of the Mediterranean, and then the Edinburgh History of the Greeks during the Ottoman era. Molly Greene is teaching history at Princeton University, and she will introduce you the panel. Molly, please go ahead.
Thank you, Baki. It used to feel good to be someone's senior colleague, but as time goes on, it feels worse and worse. So I'd first like to introduce Professor Cemal Kafadar, the Vehbi Koç Professor of Turkish Studies at Harvard University. He needs no introduction, but I will give him one anyway. Probably the most important fact of his career is that he was my advisor when I was a graduate student in Near Eastern Studies at Princeton. And I came into Princeton to do the history of the modern Middle East. I was perhaps the first, but by no means the last, of all of the people, the many, many Ottomanists that he has trained. And in part, I think he's been able to do this because of his ability to make the Ottomans and Ottoman history so mesmerizing. He writes on everything from the conquest of the night, Janissaries, late Ottoman and early Republican Turkish historical writing, and of course his beloved Evliya Çelebi. He's also a very engaged public intellectual, working hard, and it is very hard work, on preservation in Istanbul. He curated a number of films for the 2009 International Film Festival in Istanbul. Then on to Hakan Erdem, also an Ottoman historian and now retired from Sabancı University. He has written on, among other subjects, Ottoman slavery and the Greek War of Independence. And I just discovered today that he has written 3 novels, which is pretty impressive. Let me just say personally that I think that I'm just wowed by his article, Do Not Think of the Greeks as Agricultural Laborers, and I use it in all of my classes. Dr. Ioannis Grigoriadis is the Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Bilkent University. He is Senior Fellow and Head of the Program on Turkey at ELIAMEP, that is the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. He has worked on different aspects of Greek-Turkish relations and the legacy of the Ottoman Empire, and writes not only about Greeks and Turks, but Palestinians, Kurds, and Alevis in Turkey. Last but not least, Christine Philliou, to continue the silsila. She was my first graduate student, and it's funny that she lives in the same town as Baki now, because she and I are from the same town in Massachusetts. Christine is a pioneer in arguing that she was one of the first, that the Greek Revolution was also a vitally important event in Ottoman history. Sorry, I should back up. She is associate professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Berkeley. And she's also a pioneer in bringing the Ottoman perspective on the war, really for the first time, to a Greek audience. She did this with her now classic book, Biography of an Empire, built around the life of Stefanos Vogoridis. And she did many other things in that book now. And she has just come out with a new book, Turkey, A Past Against History, which has, sorry, I wasn't up to date, which has just catapulted her into the rank of full professor. So congratulations for that. Again, built around the life of an individual, Rafiq Khalid Karay. Even though it just came out, I'm pretty proud of myself. I've already read it. It is a sophisticated treatment of the concept of dissent, the muhalefet, in modern Turkey, as well as a page turner. I can attest to that. It really is an incredibly exciting and readable account of the dramatic years around the birth of the Republic. And in my view, an outstanding explication of the continuities between late Ottoman and early Republican history in Turkey. So that's it for my introductions.
Thank you, Molly. I'll take it then. I too would like to start with thanks to Molly first for her kind, generous words, and to the organizers, first of the Delphi Economic Forum, where we had an early incarnation of this panel with Şükrü as a fourth participant who can't be with us today, Şükrü Ilıcak, that is. And of course, to Baki for making it possible for the second incarnation, because at the first, we all felt that we did not have enough time to deepen the conversation and the discussions. And Christine, I think then, and Ioannis maybe took the initiative for bringing us together again under the auspices of OTSA. And here we are. And I would like to thank the panelists for honoring me with this position of the chair. And I learned a lot from them through the years, reading their works, but also at our earlier discussions in May, was it? In May at the Delphi Economic Forum. Now that Molly has made my job easier, I need not introduce the speakers one by one. I just want to give you the order of the presentations and then turn to each speaker and move from one to the other without further introduction so that we can have a smooth follow-up from one to the other presentation, beginning with Dr. Ioannis Grigoriadis, and then moving on to Dr. Hakan Erdem, and then to Dr. Christine Philliou. It is my privilege. It has been my privilege, and it is my privilege to be in this role. Each speaker has 15 minutes, and then hopefully we'll turn to lively discussion. So, Ioannis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cemal. Thank you very much, Molly and Baki, for the introductions. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you today. As Cemal said, we first met in the context of the Delphi Economic Forum, which organized a series of panels, like virtual panels given the circumstances, on the 200th anniversary of the Greek War of Independence. And I think that it was a very important decision they made to add a panel on the Ottoman repercussions of this. So this is something that I found very important and very welcome, because it really did justice to the event, which was an event that had ramifications way beyond the southern tip of the Balkan Peninsula or like the Greek world in that respect. And all of our contributions have tried to point towards that direction, that the Greek War of Independence was not just an isyan in the Ottoman sort of like context, like an uprising in a remote corner of the empire, but had profound effects. So my presentation is going to explore how the Greek War of Independence had a profound effect on the communal relations of a part of the Ottoman Empire, which is not the first we think when we think about the Greek War of Independence, and this is Ottoman Syria. So, so my presentation is going to be about, and I will be sharing my, just give me 1 minute, I will be sharing my screen on that. It will be on how the Greek War of Independence has affected the community dynamics within the Christian community of Syria, particularly Aleppo. So, of course, this refers to the whole discussion of the Millet System, which I'm not going to get into detail, how, when, whether the Millet System was like dating back to the 15th century, or is it something that was invented in the 19th century and somehow projected into the past. Of course, there's a very important layer here to highlight, which is the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Its attempt to regulate the Orthodox communal relations within the Ottoman Empire. But as we can see from the sources, this ability of the Ecumenical Patriarchate has been vacillating over the centuries and over the decades. So in that respect, one can argue that while the Ottoman authorities tended to take a more neutral position in intra-Christian affairs throughout the Ottoman years, ever since the late 17th century, it turned out that the Ottoman Empire considered the Orthodox as more reliable and loyal compared to the Catholic population of the Ottoman Empire. So there is no more neutrality in intra-Christian affairs, and the Orthodox Patriarchate is considered to be more trustworthy. And this, of course, allows the Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate in that respect to extend its influence in Ottoman territories that used to belong to other Christian ecclesiastical jurisdictions. We can witness this both in the Balkans. So when the Archbishopric of Ohrid, of Ahris, is dismantled, the same is happening with the Pech Serb Patriarchate. So the Orthodox Patriarchate expands its influence in the Balkans to unprecedented lengths. But a similar process is taking place in Syria. And of course, a central point in that respect is the city of Aleppo, a very important trading hub that hosted a very big Christian population. And of course, diverse Christian population. They were Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek Orthodox. And what makes, of course, Aleppo quite interesting is that under the special conditions that the French capitulations introduced in the late 17th century, there are intensive missionary activities that lead to the emergence of a Greek Catholic community. So a uniate community that has the external characteristics, sort of it prays and behaves as if it's part of the Orthodox Millet, but in practice, it recognizes the Pope as spiritual leader. This, of course, is facilitated by the fact that the important members of the Aleppo Christian elite community, like trade community, shift to Catholicism. And this raises a major concern, of course, in Constantinople. And given the fact that the Ecumenical Patriarchate is now able to appeal to the authorities as the most loyal Christian denomination within the Ottoman Empire, they're able to get them deliver some of their demands. So in the early 18th century, there is a very interesting appointment by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. A new bishop is established in Aleppo, and the Diocese of Aleppo is moved from the Patriarchate of Antioch, that is based in Damascus, because the Ecumenical Patriarchate wants to establish direct control. What is interesting, of course, in that split in the Christian population of Aleppo is that there is a new discussion about the room. Some of the Aleppine Greek Catholics, like those who shift to the Catholic population, the Catholic denomination, they remember the last years of the Byzantine Empire, when there was this discussion about the union of churches and the uniates, those who supported the union with the Catholic Church and those who opposed it. We know that there was a decision taken, a political decision by the Byzantine emperors to join the Christian world, and there was a union signed in Florence, which was not implemented because of popular dissent. But now the Aleppine Christians say that we are those who are the successors of those who signed that agreement. So we are the real room, because we represent the continuity with the last emperors of the Byzantine Empire who wanted to join the Catholic Church. So you are not original. So the Orthodox are the real heretics here. It's not the Melkites, as they will be called a bit later, that they are the heretics. It's the Orthodox who are the heretics. Of course, this was not going to hold very strong as long as the Ottoman authorities would take the side of the Orthodox Church. And eventually, just a few years before the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence, there is an intervention by the Ottoman authorities, a violent intervention in favor of the Greek Orthodox authorities in Aleppo. So the Melkites, or the Greek Catholics, are suppressed. And the big irony here is that they're suppressed by an Ottoman officer who would later participate in the wars in Greece, Khurshid Pasha. Is appointed as the governor of Aleppo, who has the order to suppress the uprisings of the Melkites, the Greek Catholics, against the local Orthodox bishop. And as we can see in the sources, and Bruce Masters has written extensively on this, when the new bishop arrives, and the new bishop is sent by the Patriarchate in Istanbul, and is not accepted by the majority of the local Christians, Khurshid famously asked them that, if you're not Christians, are you Muslims or Jews? If you're Christians, you must obey the Patriarch. You can't be Christians and not obey the Patriarch. So this is an interesting moment. Just before the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence, the Ecumenical Patriarchate has completely sort of subscribed, the Ottoman authorities have completely joined the cause of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in homogenizing the Orthodox Christian communities or the Melkite community in the Levant. Of course, a few years later, the war breaks out, and this proves a golden opportunity for the Melkites to turn the table against the Orthodox. Why? Because the Orthodox are now the traitors. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate is no more the trusted religious organization of the Ottomans. They are the new traitors in that respect, and hence the Patriarch is hanged in Istanbul. And the Phanariots are responsible for all this conspiracy. And the Melkites have a stronger voice when they claim that we are the true room. Why? Because the Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment has introduced a new element of identity into the discussion, that we are Greeks. We're not Romans, we're Yunan. So the Melkites say they're Yunan. So the Aleppine Orthodox are Yunan, while we are the true room. So this ends up as a disaster for the Greek Orthodox community of Aleppo, that although it was not involved in the uprising that was taking place at the same time in the Peloponnese or in the Aegean Islands and in other parts of what is today Greece, they paid a very high price. So they lost all the privileges that the Ottoman authorities had confirmed to them just a few years before the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence. And most importantly, this led to the end of the Ottoman tradition of not recognizing other religious communities from the institutional point of view. So one can argue that the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence facilitated the recognition of the Catholic, Jewish, and eventually the Melkite Millet. So, and this, of course, Millet was led by an important figure of the Melkite community in the region, Maximus III Mazlum. So he was the person who tried to develop this argument in a more sophisticated sense that, we represent the uniates of the late years of the Byzantine Empire. So this is not a heresy. This is really the orthodoxy. Why? Because the Byzantine emperors had chosen to do this. So it is those who opposed the union in the 15th century that they were the heretics that eventually kind of dominated thanks to Ottoman support. So that's a very interesting twist of how, of course, things were understood later in the Ottoman and, of course, in the Greek context. Nevertheless, I think it's important, and I would like to conclude with this point, so we can have, I try to keep in time so we have time for discussion, that the Greek War of Independence had a profound and understudied effect on community dynamics within the Levantine Christians. We normally talk about the effect of the Greek War of Independence in the Balkans and the sort of the trigger effect that it had in the development of the Bulgarian nationalism or Albanian nationalism. But there was a very important influence in Ottoman Syria as well. This, of course, facilitated the rise of the Melkite community, particularly in Aleppo, but in other parts of Ottoman territories in the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, this development marks the beginning of an end of a system that regulated religious diversity for a long time and could be substitute for competing nationalist movements. So in that respect, we can understand better through this transformation why different nationalist movements emerged in different parts of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, there are some interesting observations that I would like to make before concluding my presentation. It is that the Arabic-speaking Greek Orthodox populations of the Levant were never part of the Greek imagined community. So throughout the 19th century, while Turkish-speaking Orthodox populations of Anatolia and other parts, even in the Balkans, so the Gagauz community, for example, they were considered to be members of the Greek community, and there were intensive efforts, educational or political, to engage them with the Greek national movement. This was never the case with the Arabic-speaking Greek Orthodox or Melkite or populations of Lebanon or Syria, of Jordan or Palestine and so on. So these populations have maintained a very interesting room identity up to date. So the word room is much more commonly used in Lebanon or in Syria to identify these populations. It's much more common and much more political compared to the discussion in Greece, whereby the distinction between Greek and Rum or Hellen and Romnios has acquired completely different dimensions, because it really refers to how somebody perceives modernization and whether we are fully fledged members of the European community, or we are Balkan or let's say Oriental to some degree. So most Greeks would understand the word Romnios as being part of the Orient, while the word Greek is being part of the West. So I'd like to conclude my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Ioannis. And our next speaker is Hakan Erdem. Hakan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I also thank for the organizers for bringing us together again. Ioannis gave us a lot of things to chew on, especially in terms of terminology, and I'll come to that. But before this, I'd like to say a few things on the importance of the series of events that are known as Greek Revolution in the 19th century. This was something unheard of for the Ottomans. I'm looking from the angle of the Ottomans at the issue. Not that they didn't lose any territory before, they did, both Christian and Muslim. But for the first time, one of the subject group of peoples gained sovereignty. So this presented a very hard task for the Ottomans to make meaning of. You know, how could that be possible? How is it that our beloved Reaya wants to be independent, what a nonsense, etc. But such was the reality. And at the end of the day, they somehow managed to learn to live with it. So, I mean, the Ottomans lost Crimea to the Russian Empire, lost Tamashwar to the Austrians, but for the first time, the Reaya gained sovereignty. So how would you categorize them? Alexander Ypsilantis's early March Declaration of Independence was translated in Babali in a very faithful way, I should say, except for a few references to ancient Greek history, you know, heroes like Leonidas or Epaminondas, they were left out on purpose, but they translated this in an excellent way. In the document was talking about an entity called Illinois, a country called Hellas. So if you were an Ottoman, how would you meet these terms? You have your own room, you have your traditional Rumelia, but somebody's talking about Hellas and, you know, not Romeos, not Rome, but somebody's talking about Hellas and Illinois. So I don't exactly know how, but something comes up to the mind of a cheeky person, perhaps, somewhere in Ottoman bureaucracy, and they came up with the forgotten Arabic word Yunan, Yunanistan for the country, Yunani for people, Yunan for people. Ultimately, again, I mean, this is a corruption of Arabic corruption of Ionia. So it has got something to do with the Greeks, but not the Greeks, you know, in the Peloponnesus. So the rebels, because I mean, the Greek War of Revolution was a revolution. I have no scruples for that at all. I mean, but it was also a rebellion, a revolt, a war of independence, as well as a civil war, as the case often is. I mean, in other revolutions, we have the same, you know, variation of names. So at the end of the day, they came up with a term, Yunan, Yunanistan, Yunaniler, to meet the language of the very strong language of elated language of the Greek nationalists, Yunanistan. If only to deny. I mean, first they found a name for the Greek and Greece as passing in the declarations, then they denounced it in a very flat way. What unspeakable nonsense. Greece? Is this a country? No. I mean, such an unspeakable nonsense. It is ironic that at the end of the day, when after tribulations, wars, massacres, counter massacres, foreign intervention, etc., 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 when they decided to acknowledge and recognize the sovereignty of their subject Greeks, they preferred Yunanistan, but never Rum or Rumelia. So we have this bifurcation, and a new world emerged, a new balance is there. I mean, they learned how to live with a new sovereign nation, Greece, that is Yunan. Of course, it has got nothing to do with their beloved Rum, cannot be. And they kept the name Rum and Rumeli for those Greeks who did not live under the authority of the sovereign Greek state. This bifurcation exists in the Turkish language down to this day. If somebody is talking about an Istanbul Greek, she is Rum, not Yunan. And we don't even think about that, but I mean, that was quite, intentional on the part of the Ottomans when they revived or when they invented a new name for the independent Greeks. So, but of the new balance or the way they learned to cope with the new state, well, I mean, most Greeks, it was a revolution, partially successful and partially not so successful. I mean, the Greeks became independent only in the Morea, in the Peloponnesus. There were more Greek subjects in the Ottoman Empire than in independent Greece. Moreover, some Greeks from the kingdom, it turned out that it became not a republic, but a kingdom at the end with the German prince. They were immigrating to Ottoman Western Anatolia. So it took a while for the Ottoman administrators that, yes, there is an independent Greece, but after all, there are a lot of Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. And yes, they executed during the age of Mahmud II a patriarch and a former patriarch, but they honored the other patriarchs in early Tanzimat. They were the receivers of imperial fermans, and they were part and parcel of Ottoman officialdom, and they passed for Ottoman grandees, to the point that when the empire was able to declare a reform edict, the very famous edict of 1856, a real turning point, when the empire, the central government, eradicated the differences between Muslims and non-Muslims, truly a revolution in itself. The Greek patriarch was present. So by and by, there were Greek officials in the Ottoman administration. They were particularly strong in the foreign service. There are examples. I mean, a couple of foreign ministers like Sava Pasha or Musurus, the famous ambassador in London, then Athens. So the Greeks found their way back into Ottoman officialdom, and the Ottomans learned to live with their Greeks, and they had a new entity called Greece. Things weren't that rosy, of course. I mean, there were a number of problems. There were many people who had mixed loyalties, shifting loyalties, and we can talk of something like that, an ambiguous identity as well. I mean, there were people who live in Anatolia. They were Ottoman Greeks, calling themselves Ottoman Greeks, but they had their passports, they had their citizenship papers from the local Greek consul. And were they Yunan, were they Greek? I mean, and this really was a big matter, issue of citizenship or subjectship in rest of the 19th century. Luckily, I mean, these days, more and more people study, work on such issues, and we are able to learn more. But one way or other, the world was upside down, the world was destroyed, and a new world was established. And there was a place for Greeks in this new Ottoman world, in addition to the fact that they recognized independent Greece. The fact that the revolution wasn't that successful in the eyes of the political, later generation political leaders of Greece meant more often than not irredentist politics. I'm not going into that at all, but they ended up with the so-called Asia Minor catastrophe. I mean, you can push the issue that far, but let me finish with this so that we should have more time to discuss and get questions. The role of the Greek Revolution in the birth of Greece itself is obvious, but its role in the shaping of Ottoman modernization and even the birth of modern Turkey is somehow glossed over. Actually, that revolution gave a good kick to the ancient Ottoman order, and the end result was a modernized Turkey as well. Okay, let me finish with that.
Terrific, thank you. Everybody's right on time. And despite the fact we have a bit of a leeway with Şükrü Ilıcak's absence, but at least that reminds me of reminding the listeners to and to alert them to the fact that we did have a fourth panelist, Şükrü Ilıcak, who unfortunately could not join us today, but his work is obviously in conversation with the works of colleagues speaking here and extremely relevant for what we are discussing. And our third speaker today is Christine Philliou, who now has the floor. I don't see her face on my screen. That's why I hesitated for a second, but it's just the strange happenings of the Zoom era. Christine, now I see you. Please
I
take
am
it
here.
away.
I think I have to speak in order to be seen. That's how Zoom works, right?
I see. Take it away.
The speaker view. Thank you so much. I'm not sure who to thank first. I'll thank all of you, Ioannis, for coming up with this idea in the first place, and Baki for wanting to continue it, and all of you for your contributions last time and this time. Baki and I came up with this title and didn't give it much thought, and I thought it actually merits somewhat of a reframing, because it's a subtle shift from the Delphi Economic Forum title, but actually has pretty profound consequences for how we're going to continue our discussion. The earlier title had been Ottoman Views of the Greek Revolution, which was a great title. And it was, framed for an audience interested in and informed by Greek national history. I don't think there's a single Greek in the world right now, in Greece or in the diaspora, who does not know that this is the bicentennial year of the Greek Revolution. And it has basically been the only thing in public discussion. I mean, until the fires and everything, historically speaking, it's the only thing happening in public conversation in Greece this year, to the point where some of us have started saying maybe people are fed up and they've heard too much, because everyone has come out with their perspective on the Greek Revolution. And to be honest, the Ottoman perspective on it has been taboo, right? And so the fact that we did that panel at all, and that they allowed us to do that panel in a Greek national context, was, I think, pretty path-breaking and threatening to some people. The Ottoman perspective, the Ottoman context, is not something that you want to emphasize in the Greek national story. You want to emphasize the vision, right? The premature, precocious vision for a Greek nation state, which then became realized. And the Ottomans were obstructing that and were ultimately overcome. It's, a classic story. We all know it. And it's been fascinating to watch in Greece how this has all been playing out, and that this sub discussion of Ottoman views, my book came out 10 years ago. It initiated, I believe, zero discussion in Greece, because I think it is so taboo. This year, Şükrü and a few others in Greece have started, some of them have been working on it for a long time, but the public display of this conversation has only started really this year with the occasion of the bicentennial. And so that tells us something about, the Ottoman views of the Greek Revolution. So that was the first part of our discussion at Delphi. was framed in that context. This, however, kind of puts before us a different set of problems. The Greek Revolution in Ottoman studies is also very problematic for different reasons, and also very taboo. And also present company, Hakan and Şükrü are some of the very few people in the realm of Ottoman studies that have even broached this topic at all. Here we are. I see that there are both Greeks and Turks, Ottomanists, right? There are people from all the different audiences, but let's assume right now we're talking in an Ottomanist framework. The Greek Revolution is, I mean, it's funny, Baki does not have to have any connection to Greece. And it's funny that like, he happened to learn from me that it's the bicentennial year. That goes to show how much attention is being paid in Turkey and in Ottoman studies to the fact that this is 200 years since 1821. And it's because, you know, obviously there are deeper issues about the way the field is configured, and the field is implicitly Turkish for valid reasons, and maybe reasons that we could also be rethinking on this occasion. And the main takeaway, I think, within Ottoman studies until recently is that the Greek Revolution happened. It was a military failure and humiliation for the Ottomans. It was the Ottomans lost, therefore let's not look into it too much because it's a humiliation. And it was the beginning of the end, and it was the beginning of what was often referred to, and in historiography too, as this miasma of Balkan nationalism, right? So the Greeks, and you could argue the Serbs a little bit earlier or not, I would think maybe not, but the Greeks for sure in carving out a space of sovereignty, as Hakan pointed out, were the pioneers in this devolution of the empire. It's interesting that in Ottoman studies, again, with present company excluded, it has kind of remained what it was in the rhetorical realm for Ottoman leaders at the time. It's still kind of sat there as sedition, betrayal, uprising, right? And so we haven't quite moved beyond that. And what I had tried to do in my book on the Ottomanist side too is bring Phanariots to center stage. Of course, Phanariots started the revolution, but we don't really understand what they were thinking. I mean, we don't really understand the Ottoman context of the uprisings. We don't, because I think, and this is where Greek and Turkish Ottoman studies converge, is that both sides have some pretty deep assumptions about the fact that this was a conflict between two discrete forces, and that what I see in my work as an extremely painful untangling of Ottoman and Greek, whether you call it Rum ultimately gets untangled or Yunan at the beginning, it says something about the enmeshment and the deep patronage relationships, social, economic, cultural relationships. Not that it was always peaceful, we don't need to go in that direction, but the depth of interconnectedness, it's in the interest of both national sides to just look beyond that and look at it as a military conflict that was, one side won and one side lost, and period. So with my work, I tried to really take a step back from that and transcend that outlook. How did the Greek Revolution look from Istanbul? What does Istanbul mean? Does Istanbul mean the Central Ottoman state? No, to me, Istanbul means also the Patriarchate. It means these Phanariot dragomans and other officials and their households and their families that kind of laid claim to this strange form of power that had developed betwixt and between. So when we look in, and this is where I think also one of the reasons that the early 19th century has, for the most part, just been left alone in Ottoman studies, because it's chaos. And I have to say, I've been reading up again in some sources in the early 19th century, and I've been trying really hard not to make that supposed Orientalist judgment that things were chaotic. And at a certain point, I had to just stop and say, like, okay, at what point do we just concede that it really was chaotic? Like, it is really hard to find patterns in how people were relating to each other and whatnot. this then makes the question of who the insurgents were in the Ottoman context, what they thought they were doing, it makes it much more complicated and much more ambiguous, right? I find it, as a historian, I find it very hard to believe that the treatises about the Greek nation, about ancient Greece, and about, you know, resurrecting the Greek nation, I find it very hard to believe that all the actors involved in these insurrections understood. And we know that they didn't, like down at the mass level. People have brought up lots of evidence that they really didn't understand things that way. And I guess one way that we could sort of continue our previous discussion and open out into the Q&A is to think about the fact that what if we reframe the before, during, and after of the Greek Revolution in Ottoman studies and in the Ottoman Empire, and we focus on the improvised nature of Ottoman governance, really since the 17th century, since the Köprülü Restoration, right? This is about, to Rifat Abul-Hajj, of course, right? Let's look at how power was actually working, how it was improvised, what solutions were come up with. Things were not necessarily thought through in advance. We can talk about the New Order reforms in Selim III as somewhat of an exception to that, right? Rather than the success failure, rather than the who wins and who loses, let's look at it in the context of improvised governance. And I think that the events of the 1820s look very different in that way too. And I tried to argue that in the middle chapters of my first book, right? That like the way that conflict, there's the question of the causes and the context of the conflict. There's the question of how the conflict unfolded. I don't think anyone could have predicted. There's the question of the contingencies involved, including Navarino and of course the great powers, the complete reconfiguration of the Ottoman relationship to the outside world and to the great powers as a result of this. And what I'm finding more and more in some other research I'm doing now about this moment is really the interconnectedness between some of these Rum and Janissary elements, which I'm sure Hakan can also tell us about, really like on the ground, everyday kind of relationships that, you know, and again, I tried to argue for this in the book. I now have more evidence to argue for it. Outbreak of the revolution in 1821 to the abolishment of the Janissaries in summer of 1826, that, that clears away, not just, as Hakan said, it doesn't just become a catalyst for modernization in the empire, it really erases that improvised governance that was happening and that interconnectedness I've been talking about between the Rum and Ottoman officialdom and military. And so we, in order to fully appreciate what the revolution meant in the Ottoman context and in Ottoman studies, we really have to go much further in integrating those stories, right? And that the military story for the Ottoman Empire has always been seen as really separate and separable. But, you know, we know also from Cemal's earlier work that the military, the Janissaries, were embedded in urban society, particularly in Istanbul, in the esnafs, right? So I would think that a lot of the premises of Ottoman studies have to shift in order to fully incorporate the meaning of the Greek Revolution in Ottoman studies, way beyond the Greek national framework or the Turkish national framework. And that's, you know, I have a bunch of questions for the other speakers too. And I think I might just leave it at that so that hopefully, I don't know how many people watched our first session, or I'm sure there are questions and points about this one, but thank you all for listening. And I'll leave it at that.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Ioannis, Hakan, and Christine. Before I turn to the audience with questions, I'll abuse my prerogative. I hope I'm forgiven for this, and make one general remark and then ask one question, not necessarily to be answered immediately, but to consider as part of our conversation that will unfold. General remark has to do with where Christine ended her comments, that some of the basic premises, some of the basic modes of operation in the field of Ottoman studies, I believe, need to change to understand major events and phenomena and processes like the Greek Revolution and some others. This has, I'm sure, been dawning on us for a while, and there are some pioneers who've taken it here or there. On the one hand, there's the question of languages, and here we have some of the pioneers in terms of at least bringing together mainstream, so-called, even that word could be problematized, Ottoman studies languages, by which one normally means El-Sine-i Selase, the three major Islamic community languages, and bringing together some of those with Greek, if not others, that already has been an important step and yielded a good many important eye-opening works. To look at it very broadly, we are blessed and cursed with an endlessly fascinating, profoundly varied world that we are studying that has also pitched at us an amazing, a dizzying array of languages with big bounty of source materials of all sorts. And the field has not ever really structured itself accordingly for various historical reasons that we can also study on their own and understand. The field has not structured itself accordingly and now is trying to make adjustments. So there's a question of languages. We definitely need to create, I believe, new cocktails of linguistic skills in conversation with one another, ideally. There have always been people who did look at Greek or Bulgarian or some other Slavic or Arabic or Caucasian language sources. But the trick is really a bit more than that, to bring them into conversation with one another on a regular basis and to make cocktails, to make workable cocktails of these linguistic skills. And it's more than a matter of linguistic skills. I remember the last time I was in Junda for the summer school, I was there with Yorgo Dedes, whose name I see here. And we were on the boat going on the backside of the island and looked at some structures. And he commented, and I cannot forget, he said, there is that, in Turkish he was speaking, there is that kilise, which is not a real kilise, but you Turks call everything a kilise. It's a paraklesia. And he is so damn right. It's much more than a matter of linguistic skills. It's a matter of the basic information that we consider to be part of the training in Ottoman studies. What's the difference between a monk and a priest, really? Does a solidly trained, highly accomplished Ottomanist know these things? What are the differences between Armenian and Greek Orthodox church apparatuses, institutionally speaking, not to mention dogma and doctrine and all of that kind of thing? This is not even considered to be regular stuff in the training of Ottomanists. And I believe this is a profound mistake, at least at this point. As I said, I'm not trying to assess the history of the field, but where we can go from here and where we should and would like to go, at least I would like to go, is what I'm talking about. That's by way of a general comment. Now, by way of a question, I have two or so, but I'll just raise one. When I was entering the field, or even before, reading up on things historical and considering studying history, this kind of a conversation on the Greek Revolution would definitely have certain words that were not mentioned today: bourgeoisie, capitalism. So my question to the panelists is it because the evidence base for that kind of analysis is now significantly different, that we moved very differently, empirically speaking, or is it because those explanatory frameworks do not serve us well? But have we discussed this, or are we, as we generally do in Ottoman studies, abandon paradigms and abandon analytical frameworks without much debate, which I think is another serious mistake? So I wonder how you relate the panelists to the literature of the 60s and 70s, to characters like Trajan Stojanovic or Nikolai Todorov, to whom Abba merchants were the makers of Bulgarian nationalism, if you recall, or among the most significant makers, so on and so forth. I'm sure my question is clear. Perhaps we can just start by getting your response to this while I collect questions on the chat box.
Yeah,
Christine, yes.
That's a great question. I do have those categories and those historians in the back of my mind when I read sources from this period. And I guess what I do is I try to hold them at bay, because I find all kinds of people involved in commerce who could be considered bourgeoisie, right? Who aren't necessarily doing the things they're supposed to be doing in that framework. When it comes to, I have found, I think so far provisionally valid, the Todorov argument, or the Marxist argument that Bulgarian nationalism, although that was a different animal, right? The move for an autonomous Bulgarian church, let's say mid to late 19th century, was partly a result of the vacuum left by these Greek merchants who had all those janissary, like I think it's also the Greek and janissary connections in the trade routes that were eliminated and cleared a space. Bulgarian speakers, and I can say that based on my sample from my first book, before 1821, before the 1820s, if you were a Bulgarian speaker and you were ambitious and you wanted to get to Istanbul or have some glory of any kind, you learned Greek and you became Hellenized. Otherwise, you stayed there, you were a dairy farmer or a livestock farmer, and you just stayed in your little area, right? After the 1820s, that's one of the things that were shaken up, is that then a critical mass of Bulgarian speakers moved to Istanbul without having to Hellenize. And then we get the emergence in the 1830s and after of a Bulgarian colony in Istanbul that is then in close proximity to power and the patriarchate, and then they can butt up against each other and try to carve out a space. That kind of structural analysis I do see. But that kind of mechanistic, I mean, again, I guess I just keep that suspended because I don't want to make assumptions about the behavior and what was going on in the heads of these merchants, because the ones I see, again, in this other research too, are not necessarily involved in those kinds of networks that are leading to the Philliou and whatnot. So that would be my answer. Yes and no, basically.
Thank you.
May I?
Yes, Hakan, please.
Yeah, actually, if I may chime in, Christina was talking about Philliou, and it's a good point to pick up. Well, I mean, on the surface of it, these guys could pass for commercial bourgeoisie. All of them were merchants, and they were so instrumental in establishing a secret society, an enlightened secret society. And it's entirely possible for us historians to construct an account and giving a very primary role to the bourgeoisie in the Greek Revolution. I mean, just tell each other's tales, etc. But I mean, may I gently remind you such a basic fact that the Ottoman Greeks dominated Black Sea Mediterranean trade from ancient times onwards, and from time immemorial onwards, and they enjoyed the privileges of being the most favored merchants under the Ottoman flag. And if they support the revolution, they dynamite their well-being. And so why should these people be revolutionaries? And now we know that, I mean, thanks to research, level of Greek foreign trade could not reach the same levels of, say, 1810 up until 1870s. This was such a backlash. So probably because of such, issues, it's difficult to pass a judgment and create an argument for any one group, this or that. I mean, you can have a similar, the argument for the role of enlightened nationalists, and more often than not, they overlapped with the bourgeoisie. But how influential were they? I mean, so yes, I mean, there are these ties, Cemal, especially if you are keen on to follow the cues. But the Greek Revolution was, I think, none of the above. Perhaps an amalgamation of all. Perhaps there are other issues we have never touched at this, meeting. They played a part. And I mean, for the Ottomans, it did not make sense at all. It was not something rational. And if you were Ottoman, then you would give some credit for this thought, because it was not rational. So human beings sometimes are not rational.
Could I ask a question to Hakan, actually,
Yes.
in earnest?
Go ahead, please.
Because I thought it was fascinating when you're talking about the translation of Ypsilantis's declaration. And I wonder, do we know who translated it?
No.
Because I would imagine it was actually one of these Phanariot guys who is creating the vocabulary for the Ottomans to understand this event. I mean, I think it's a high probability, but I don't know. So that would be fascinating to figure out.
Well, yes, I mean, I tried a lot, but it is difficult. I mean, the chances are that it could be Muruzi, still at this time, chief dragoman. But I mean, I have no hard evidence for that, no, unfortunately, no.
Yeah, that's great. Anyway, thank you.
Ioannis?
Yes, I would just like to share a couple of thoughts on this very important issue. I think even in the case of Aleppo, it becomes clear that elites matter. So the rise of the Melkite community is due to the fact that a very significant part of the Christian merchant elite of the city chooses to join French interests and sort of like engage with the Catholic Church that is sponsored by the French state in the late 18th century Syria. So this is a fact. But on the other hand, to understand the dynamics of the Greek War of Independence and modern Greece, we need to go beyond the elites. And I think a very important point to understand this is how strong the room identity of the citizens of the modern Greek state remained at the bottom level. So this whole idea of Hellas and Hellenism, it took many years for this to strike roots. And to some degree, I think that this whole Zambelius-Paparigopoulos scheme, trying to bridge ancient Greece and modern Greece through the Byzantine Empire, not against the Byzantine Empire, which was the original idea, very much attests to that need to reconsider the role of the agricultural population, the lower middle class that was not involved in this grandiose sort of scheme of reconstituting Hellas through the instruments of the Enlightenment.
Okay, thank you. Molly, did you want to speak on this point specifically?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to your general question about the bourgeois, and then if I could sneak in a couple of questions. I think there's something bigger in terms of not using the word bourgeois, and here I'm speaking very generally, but I certainly, when I have taught History 500 from time to time in the history department, we have talked a lot about, I would say the decline of Marxism, or maybe not the decline of Marxist analysis, but a very important book in that regard, at least according to those of us who taught History 500, was Weapons of the Weak, which is a direct response to 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union. And there's no longer necessarily an expectation of a bourgeois revolution. There is a tremendous interest today in sort of a global history seen as the history of global capitalism. I won't get into that, but I do think that is one reason why the bourgeoisie might not seem so interesting or significant to people today. that's a more general comment about where historians stand with regard to Marxism and the concept of the bourgeoisie. But I'm certainly not a specialist on the Greek Revolution. But my understanding is, since the 60s and 70s, there's also been, one paradigm of what the Greek Revolution is about is that it was very much an attempt to protect the ancien regime against modernizing reforms. I mean, whether it's Selim or later on Mahmud. Cemal, that Şükrü Ilıcak has talked about the process of de-Ioanization, right? That this is what's going on from 1812 onwards. And I think Tom Gallant, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, has talked about how the Klefts, the Armatols in the Morea and in central Greece were trying to protect their privileges. So in that sense, it's really not at all a bourgeois revolution. And although it starts to, it is a blow against the Ottoman ancien regime, a lot of this is out of a desire to defend the ancien regime. So in fact, it's not a forward-looking thing at all. So I would guess those are, to me, would be two big reasons why people have lost interest in the bourgeoisie, although you're absolutely right about our field that we drop things and move on. If I could be very quick, I have a question with Ioannis. Why is there this intervention in 1818 by Hurşit Pasha? Like, what's going on in that year? And you seem to be comparing favoring Catholics versus Orthodox. You seem to be comparing or including Serbs at the end of the 17th century and Catholics in Syria. But the Serbian thing isn't Catholic unless you mean that because they retreated to the Habsburg Empire, they were kind of seen as Catholic. But after all, it's not the same thing. So I was curious about that comparison. And then very quickly, when Christine talked about the taboo of the Greek Revolution, I think there's even more than that. I mean, I'm really curious because I'm working now on Thessaly. I'm very curious that Turkish scholars generally, present people accepted, don't write about the Balkans beyond the early centuries, right? Beyond the centuries of the conquest, like the city of Yenişehir, today's Larisa. Greeks don't write about it because it was a heavily Muslim city during the entire Ottoman period. But then Turks don't write about it. As far as I can tell, they'd rather write about Antep or Bursa or even Aleppo. They're not going to write about Larisa or Yenişehir because it's not seen as part of Ottoman history, I guess, because it became part of Greece. So I'd be interested in your view on that, Christine. Okay, talked long enough.
Can I
Ioannis?
answer? Oh, Ioannis, go ahead.
Thanks very much for the questions, Molly. I think I confused you with the reference to Catholic like influence in Syria and the Serbs. What I meant is that in the late 17th, 18th century, the Ecumenical Patriarchate reaches the apex of its influence, both in the Balkans and in Syria. So it kind of controls dioceses that used to be part of other patriarchates, the administration. So this, of course, answers to the first question as well, that to the extent that they can have this influence, they can have the Ottoman administration impose sanctions on populations like the Melkites that refuse to accept the authority of the Patriarchate. Of course, this tells us how strong the Patriarchate has become within the Ottoman administration, and it's an irony because this is coming to an abrupt end with the outbreak of the War of Independence, which of course produces an independent modern Greek state, but it's a disaster from the point of view of Greek influence within the Ottoman administration. As Hakan mentioned, it will take many years until the Greeks will regain the influence they had in the economic and cultural life of the empire.
Got it, thank you. And 1818 in Hurşit Pasha?
Yes, it's interesting because then he is appointed to the Tripolitsa. And he's involved yes.
Which actually makes perfect sense, right? Because he's still defending the Patriarchate, right? The Patriarchate is on the Ottoman side. And so he's defending it against enemies in Syria, and then he's defending it against insurgents who have broken from their own community, right? So it actually, and that's what I wanted to say too, is I think several studies are warranted on that short moment, 1818 to 1821. that's the moment that Hanedan-ı Arba Kanunnamesi was promulgated, right? That there's this funny, that something is going on with the relations between the patriarchate, these phanariates, you know, these Orthodox communities and the state. And it's maybe in the context of this de-Ionization, right? This attempt to recoup central power, maybe not. It might be actually the chaos that we hope it's not, but it might just be this like irrational patronage. Halet Efendi is very involved in it, right? What is happening? And my sense, again, it's still a hunch because so much more needs to be done, but my sense is that the trigger for the outbreak of these insurrections probably had in part to do with all of this patronage, upheaval, and institutionalization, and who was left out and who was included. We don't know. We just have these little bits of controversies and almost like legislations that were happening. There was the civil code, or the law codes up in Eflak and Bodan that were right around this time, inspired by the Napoleonic codes. There was this moment when different actors were attempting to establish a new kind of modus vivendi or some kind of institutionalization, and it gets wiped away, just like with the Senede Ittifak, right? That only becomes important later for a certain kind of historiography in Ottoman studies, right? It was a dead letter, I believe, immediately after. So that's the kind of improvised governance I'm talking about, that we can totally re-problematize that decade before and during the revolution in the light of all of these things that seem to not make a lot of sense or seem to have not led anywhere. So, and in terms of Turkish scholars not working on, I think the same is true for Greek scholar in Greece, and there are exceptions to this, but what I've noticed, the trend is that Greek scholars working on the Ottoman period tend to work on areas that are now part of Greece. Veria, Crete, whatever, there is of course an important subfield working on the Karamanlides, whatnot, but in general, I notice the contours kind of assume that we're going to do studies of Greece in the Ottoman period, which is a very different prospect from working on Orthodox Christians, Greek Orthodox Christians across the empire and society. And Greeks in the audience, you can tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think I would disagree a little bit. I mean, it is striking that Greek scholars generally do not write about other areas in the Balkans, right? It's hard to imagine a Greek scholar writing about Sofia, let's say, but the Greeks have written a lot about Anatolia. I mean, because they
in the 19th century, right, as an offshoot of Greek nationalism, as part of that Greek kind of national/colonial project, I think. But yeah, not as separate from it. You either do Ottoman studies or you do the Greek national stuff, and that's I don't know.
Terrific. We have an important point of information by Elizabeth Fraser. I'll just read that first. I just want to point out that the Ottoman context of the Greek War is very much part of an upcoming conference, Travel and Archaeology in Ottoman Greece in the Age of Revolution, circa 1800-1833, on September 16-17, with substantial participation of Greek scholars, sponsored by the British Institute of Athens. And then I turn to Dariusz Kovaciejczyk, who has one question to all panelists. Dariusz, please.
Hello. It's a question from alternative history. You many times mentioned in passing that Greece ended up as a monarchy. So my question is, had it remained a republic, would it had a deeper influence on the Ottoman internal discourse in the following decades? Christine Leu mentioned today, and also in her May speech, that it is highly still unprecedented to look at the tail from the dog's perspective. But I was looking for comparisons, and there was a discussion on the meaning of the Polish insurrection of 1830 on Russia. And we know that there was a mutual disenchantment, because Tsar Alexander, especially in his young years, when he was cooperating with Ypsilantis and with Czartoryski, he was not Republican, of course, but he was very much interested in experimenting with the constitutional monarchy and so on. And then you have these two uprisings, actually, that are almost in the same time. The Polish uprising lasted many months longer because Feldmarshal Dibic contracted cholera on the Ottoman front, so he died and he had to be replaced. So there are many comparisons. But my basic question is, Polish republicanism was an inspiration for many Russian reformers and revolutionaries for almost throughout the whole 19th century. So had the Greeks managed to establish a republic, would it be more important for the Ottoman discourse in the constitutional era? So that's my question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's difficult to be counterfactual, but we might have some clues as to the possible potential Ottoman reception of a Greek republic when in the Greek Civil War, when Kapodistrias was assassinated, an unknown Ottoman bureaucrat, again in the Ottoman Babali Sublime Court, he scribbled that it was clear that the government of such bandits would result in such nonsense. So for them, being Republican were worse. I mean, I can say this much. When Greece in the end became a monarchy under Otto rather than under Ottomans, big difference.
So few letters and such a big difference.
Yes, I mean, yes. I think it was a redeeming factor for the Ottomans, Darius. It made it palatable for the Ottomans to swallow the pill that Greece was not a republic, but it was a monarchy.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that it's so hard to imagine it. And it's not to say they deserved a monarchy, because I know that's a very sore point in Greece, right? That like the tutelage that came in after the Civil War and the assassination. But it is to say that this is all the more reason why really understanding the Ottoman context is important, because the assemblage of groups that lined up for the cause of Greek independence were so diverse that the fact that it ended and was aborted is almost, I think, just proof of how disparate those groups were. It wasn't just the bourgeoisie, it wasn't just the phanariates, it wasn't just the klefts and the clan leaders, and it wasn't just the lower clergy, but all of these groups had such different understandings, I think, of what was going on and what, right? I don't know, Ioannis, what do you think as the political scientist in the group?
I agree on that, and I would like to add to the fact that if you look into the early constitutional texts of the revolutionaries, they're very, very advanced for their time. So the definition of who is a Greek, the definition that the protection of fundamental human rights for everybody on Greek territory is really, really amazing. And if you can look into the story behind this, for example, there is a jurist, a young lawyer born in Melnik, which is today in Bulgaria, studied in Germany, Anastasios Polyzoidis, who then translates the American Declaration of Independence and introduces elements of this into the Greek revolutionary constitution. But then, of course, on the one hand, you have the struggle between the established ancien regime against the reformists who come mainly from abroad. And this struggle is reflected in the Capodistria case as well. And on the other hand, of course, you have the bitter fact that Greek independence came with terms and conditions because of Navarino. So this is something that, of course, the Greek national narrative has kind of sidelined to some degree, but Greece, it was impossible for Greece to be a republic given the circumstances that led to the Greek independence. But of course, as Hakan said, this made it more palatable for everybody, including Europe and the Ottoman Empire as well.
Cemal, we don't hear you.
Okay. Hasan Çolak has a question. I know that this is not really central to the research agendas of the speakers, but I wonder how they evaluate the role of the Philiki Eteria for the Greek Revolution and how the Ottoman administration perceived this secret society?
Well, I mean, it seems that they didn't attach too much importance to that secret society at all. I mean, I haven't found any contemporary reflection on Philiki Eteria in the archives, but if you read Cevdet Pasha, you have a lot, and he translates this literally into Ottoman Turkish as Dostane Şirket, Philiki Eteria, and he has a lot to say. But I think that at the time of the revolution, the Ottomans did not pay any attention. I mean, other than that, Alexander Ypsilantis, at first they thought that Ypsilantis was a Russian tool, etc. Later realized that it wasn't even so. So I mean, Philiki Eteria doesn't come up as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know. It doesn't play a big part in the Ottoman perception of a series of events.
Even Grigoriadis does not mention it by name when he reflects back. He says, I was invited by Ypsilantis and the others to take part in their apostasy, and I refused. So clearly there was a verbal, there was verbal circulation of what was going on. The extent to which it was really framed around the Philiki Eteria, I mean, it's become such an institution now in Greek national history, right? That it's hard to understand what people, if that name meant anything and that name was actually used broadly, but definitely I think there was a verbal circulation of that idea. So it's hard to say, because as historians we need written documentation. And it was secret and they were effective at that. So yeah.
Okay, a question from Aytek Soner Alpan. First of all, I would like to thank the speakers for their presentations. One of the unintended consequences of the Greek Revolution was the refugee question, an everlasting issue for Greece up until today. Since we are here to talk about the Ottoman context and the perspective of Istanbul, I'm using the word Istanbul in the sense Professor Philliou used it, I would like to ask how Istanbul reacted to the formation of these refugee waves traveling outward from the Ottoman lands and pouring into the borders of the nascent Greek state. A question to all panelists. Thank you again.
Refugees leaving Ottoman lands going into Greece?
That's what the question asks, yeah.
I would think opposite. I'm not sure what exactly he's referring to.
I mean,
well, either way, though,
maybe to Hermopolis, like there were some refugees from Ayvalık or from big Ottoman cities that suffered.
Yes. And some to the islands, some families ended up settling on Syros or Spetses or whatnot. But in general, I mean, I have a student who's working on this, and it's the Muslim populations that were driven out, but who became muhajirs, and there were Jews, and there were actually apparently some Christians that left and came into Ottoman land. So I think we're just at the beginning of trying to understand what that migration looked like, but I think there was clearly a lot of upheaval.
The question is more about the Ottoman response to migration. Istanbul's response to migration. Did they have?
I don't think there was a coordinated response. And even when the Circassians come in the 1860s, I know Dave Cathal's dissertation, there was a commission, but it basically didn't do much to coordinate the settlement of muhajirs, even from the Cherkess, right? So I would be surprised if there was a coordinated project.
Well, I mean, up until the establishment of the Commission of the Immigrants, Muhacirin Komisyonu, it's difficult to talk of an organized Ottoman response, but there were two waves of refugees from mainland Greece. First, the so-called Moralists. We have a layer of people coming from mostly Tripolitsa, Moralı, and such illustrious families such as Abdurrahman Sami Pasha or his family, Subki Pasha, etc. Some of them reached Egypt, then came to Central Ottoman Empire, but it is difficult to talk of a big entity. Then we have Greeks in the years, not in the immediate aftermath of the revolution or during the revolution, but after the Greek state was declared, there were many more Greeks, especially from the islands, reaching Western Anatolia and establishing households there. So at this, and of course, however, I should perhaps be more clear, we also have involuntary refugees in the shape of slaves from Greece. I mean, perhaps there were a lot more slaves than free refugees at this time, because, I mean, from Crete, from Peloponnesus, I mean, the Greek Revolution, for all practical purposes, was suppressed militarily until 1828, when the Allies interfered, and Ottoman armies enslaved many Greeks, and Greeks were sold as slaves as far east as Trabzon and Egypt. I mean, so there is that dimension as well in terms of exchange of populations, but the kind of refugee question your question conjures up in our minds today, the kind of waves upon waves of Syrians or Afghans, we don't have this.
But if I may add, may I
Yes,
add up on this? They were, like, I don't know anything about how the Ottoman authorities kind of recorded this, but of course, like from Psara, from Kassos, like from islands that were destroyed by the Ottoman forces, there are refugee waves hitting the parts of Greece that they were still under the control of the rebels. And there is a legendary figure that those of you who speak Greek or come from Greece may know. There's this Sorokostana. Like, Sorokostana is a lady that comes to represent Greece in many sort of negative connotations, that she is supposed to be a refugee from Ayvalık, like a very poor, devastated lady that lived in modern Greece and carried this sort of legacy. But as Hakan mentioned, with Tanzimat, the tide changes very fast. So populations that had left Chios or sort of like Greek inhabited territories of the Ottoman Empire that faced retaliation attacks by the Ottoman authorities, these populations resettle in these islands or in Western Anatolia, because a new flourishing, a new age of a golden age begins for the Ottoman Greek population under these circumstances. It's a very interesting and very sharp shift of fortunes.
Terrific, thank you. Virginia, please, it's your turn.
I have to unmute, and then I have to start the video, for goodness sake. Here I am.
Terrific, here you are.
I'm so happy to see everybody. It's great. Been a great conversation, and I'm very grateful to the papers that were presented. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I have been on the same path with Christine into the late 19th century. Just finished a book on updating my War and Society book, which takes the warfare from 1870 to 1923. And I have tripped over enormous collaborative projects that are underway, bringing together precisely, it seems to me, these questions, religious questions, the minority questions, and even political economy. I notice Ioannis is still with us. She and Antonis Hadjiakiru have been running this discussion center about the political economy of the late Ottoman Empire, to which I listened in for a long time. And she and I both shared chapters of current work to try to help out with that discussion about what happens to bourgeoisie and capitalism, or when they're all looking for this young group studying mostly the Jazeera and Syria and Iraq and Arabia a little bit, Aden, etc., Yemen, are very interested in locating when capitalism actually begins in various parts of the empire. So I do think a lot of that work is underway, and it may turn me into a terrible student for quite a while. sorry to be so long about that. I did want to comment on the question of the nation state. I think contemporary politics is still run as if we were at Navarino. And I do think America still views Greece as the classical origin, as Europeans do, as the classical origin of their society. It interferes with every kind of discourse, including historians and political scientists, about the way we look at these questions. And it struck me again and again. 1856 is just another example of it. And all of, so it's hard to get around that. It's very hard to get around that if you're writing in English and you're writing in the North American context. The Turkish and the Greek context are two different stories. I mean, those are still living and revivifying in various ways their own versions of their nation state history. But it's my understanding that the Balkans themselves are coming together about the way they see this late history in very, very different ways than our generation did. I hope that's useful. The other thing I wanted to say was Circassians, for example, the Muhajir, the new work it does say that they work very hard at settling, but they work very hard at settling Muslims in places where all the Christians were. So it reaffirms the kind of push to remove certain populations from certain areas. And I think that will help us out a lot. I think learning a lot more about the Hamidian period. And this question of subjecthood, which many, many, many people are taking up. When those, of course, who are competent, and I'm not, in the religious debates, as Cemal said about who's who and how they the sectarianism that Makdisi talks about in the middle of the 19th century gets a new life, a brand new life, and interferes in this discussion about what an Ottoman or an Ottoman subject looks like. So I'm very hopeful, because I remember when we started, there was no way to have this conversation. I'm now an ancient, even more ancient than Molly. Where is she? So just a comment.
Thank you, Virginia. I know Baki has been patiently waiting with some question or questions of his own. Would you like to raise them, Baki?
Oh, yes, sure. I had one question that is about the terms, which came up through the presentations of Ioannis and Hakan. Hakan was saying they first introduced this Yunan term in this translation, but Ioannis's presentation was suggesting actually it was introduced a little while ago, and I'm just wanted to ask, so is it possible that the translators of that declaration actually quote off the use of Yunan in the Melkite context and then picked it up and put it there? So in a sense, the way in which we call modern Greeks who live in Greece today in Turkey comes from originally a Catholic Greek usage. Is that what I am understanding? So this is very specific. And then something a little bit more general about Rum, and this is actually also will involve Cemal Hocam, you, Rumi. So I sense that as the term Rum becomes more prevalent, the term Rumi with reference of the Ottoman to some themselves sort of disappears. When you of course wrote a great article on the subject, you would know better than most of us. In terms of the usage of Rumi with reference to elite Ottomans' self-identity, were you able to find references in the 18th century, or does it already sort of disappear in the 18th century and Rum becomes more prevalent maybe? And if actually, this is not just for Cemal Hoca, is it in usage in Ottoman Turkish with reference to Greek Orthodox by Muslim authors before late 18th, early 19th century? So can we think about use of terms and rise of community identities, nationalism, etc., in some sort of relation? That is my specific question. And then more generally, I would wonder, because all presentations touched on how both Christine and Hakan emphasized how the Greek Revolution was so significant for the Tanzimat and the transformation of the Ottoman Empire that opened the way all the way to the modern Turkish Republic. The fact that Tanzimat didn't happen in the part of the Ottoman Empire that became Greece, how did that play out? Did Greece continue certain old regime traditions more faithfully than the rest of the Ottoman Empire at all? Or did Greece have its own sort of Tanzimat somehow?
I'd rather leave the floor to the panelists with their question, but my assessment, and I developed this in the expanded Turkish version of the article you're referring to. My sense is, well, first of all, it's definitely on the decline in the 18th century. It still appears now and again, the word Rumi. There's a parallel, but not exactly similar story of the word Bilad Rum or Diyar Rum. So there's also that particular question, reference to a geography, reference to an identity of a person, Rumi versus Bilad Rum. Bilad Rum appears as late as the Namık Kemal, for instance. So, but during the course of the 18th century, the word Rumi is on the decline. The usage of Bilad Rum is also on the decline, but not as strongly. And it has something to do, in my opinion, with the increasing use of the word Rum, association in the late 18th century in particular of the word Rum in Ottoman discourse and the Ottoman mind with a rising Greek political activism coming from Russia, among other things. For instance, in Lütfi Tarihi, the word Rum is definitely associated with that kind of thing, which one wouldn't be able to find in 17th century Ottoman discourse. For it. So there are issues around this entangled vocabulary that one could pursue. I'll just stop here. And I'm hoping to write yet another expanded version. Yes, please.
It's just on that, it would be really interesting to try to track the use of the term Rum and the shift in the term Reaya earlier to mean the flock, the taxpayers of all religions, to the 18th century when it became synonymous with the non-Muslims, right? And I wonder if this is an 18th century story. And on that question, that's a tough one, Baki, of what would have happened if Greece went through the top. I think all the Greeks would, I think that, Yanni, I have some thoughts, but I think I think that maybe the starting point to answer that would be about the nominal, the aspirational structure of governance in the new Greek state versus the actual capacity of that new state to change realities on the ground. Because I think what you get is that, you know, the new Greek state could not really provide security outside of Athens for like several decades, right? Like it was kind of a anarchic, I don't know, maybe a continuity from pre-1821 social realities for a surprising amount of time. And so that, I don't know, when did the equivalent of the Tanzimat actually happen is an open question, right? Yeah, not a great answer.
If I may follow up on this, I think it is important to remember, as we said, the special conditions of Greek independence, whereby Greece became an absolute monarchy. So this didn't allow for a lot of room for Tanzimat, right? So there was a sort of this Bavaria, so-called Bavarian rule that was remembered as a very autocratic and very harsh experience. But in a few years, Greece gets a constitution. So it becomes a constitutional monarchy in the 1840s and becomes a parliamentary monarchy in the 1870s. So there is some institutional development. And of course, there are some political movements that try to represent a more progressive or more reformist side. So you can compare, like, think of Harilos Trikoupis, for example, in the 19th century as a figure that tries to bring Greece into the Western political realm. But of course, this struggle continues, and one can argue that it continues well into the 19th and into the 20th century in many ways.
Well, and the party system of the early Greek state mirrored, I don't know, the pre-Tanzimat patronage system in court factions, and that, right, they were aligned with particular outside powers. So that's an interesting parallel.
And the Greek civil wars of the independence like reflect this very well, sort of how this revolutionaries were fragmented along tribal or like regional or political lines. That was quite telling. Regarding Baki's question on the Rum versus Yunan, I think we're witnessing two parallel processes. And if we assume that the Ottoman Greek dragoman that translated this, he was certainly aware of the Korais sort of like group of people who were speaking about Hellas already from the late 18th, early 19th century. There was a lot of struggle and controversy within the Ottoman Greek elites, between those who looked into Hellas as the way forward, a secular republic, and those who looked into this as treason. And like, if you look into the Ottoman Greek sources on how the French Revolution was received, there's a lot of interesting insights into this. Of course, in Aleppo, there was another discussion about who is the heretic and who is the true Orthodox. And in that respect, this becomes a very interesting, so there is the story of the 15th century, the union of churches. And I suspect that many of these Haleppine Melkites are aware of this new trend within the Istanbul or sort of, let's say, Balkan sort of Greek Orthodox, and they try to capture the opportunity to say that, you know, we are the true Rum and they are those Yunan. So they associate them with a population that has just gotten out of favor in the Ottoman port because of the uprising, of course, the independence war.
Yeah, Ioannis, when was it exactly when the Melkites said we are Rum and the Orthodox are Yunan?
A few weeks after the outbreak of the War of Independence.
After the War of Independence, so not before,
Interesting.
I mean, otherwise it was a very attractive way of thinking, but it seems that they made most of the kind of emerging political conflict for their own use. I mean, in a rather cheeky way.
Well, also, right. I mean, Yunan, it always has been the Arabic word, right? And so if in the Melkite Syrian context, and it's calling them pagans, basically, right?
Yeah.
So not just heretics, but pagans. The Rum are the true Christian. So it does make a lot of sense in that context. So it's fascinating.
Hakan, this is fascinating and something I never noticed or thought about. If you did write about it already, I missed it. I'm sorry. I must have overlooked it. You know, the word Yunan was also used for the Karaman region from the late medieval era onwards.
Yes.
So did that complicate the picture of this new usage ever? Did it confuse anybody?
Not really. Not any more than the term Rum was used to denote a section of Anatolia. I mean, Sivas, Amasya, Tokat, Çorum. This area was Rum for some curious reason. I mean, Mustafa Ali calls it Rumiye Sagir, small Rome, as opposed to Rumiye Kebir. But this is not Istanbul. Surprise, surprise, it's Rome. So, Rumiye Sagir, Rumiye Kebir, and as you say, for example, in Shikari's version, the Karaman lands are always called Yunan, lands of Yunan.
And was that Mustafa Ali's translation of Asia Minor? I wonder. Small, right? Small Asia.
That could be as well. I mean, because the Ottoman notaries were aware of the two types of Romans, Latin speaking and Greek speaking, and they took they took lengths to describe the situation. I mean, sometimes in order to differentiate, they would accentuate it more, calling Rome the city Rim, not Rum, Rim. Rim, and the Pope of Rome was Rim Papa. So but clearly they were aware of this fine points, and they had, it seems that 3 usages in which we find Rum. We have the Sivas Amasya Vilayeti Rum. We have Rumeli, the other side of the Bosphorus, where I live today, Rumeli. And also for all of the Ottoman lands, they had Rum. I mean, so as in the Sultan of Rum. But Baki, I mean, as time passes, we can, safely, or we can venture to say that the name, the appellation Rum came to be synonymous with Greek Orthodox rather than Muslims. I mean, to the point that I remember from a general history written under the early years of Abdülhamit, 1870s, that it talks about the Sultans of Rum, but the book warns the readers that the Rum here has nothing to do with the Greeks today. So, I mean, the authors needed to make an explanation that the title Sultan of Rum had nothing to do with Greek-speaking Christians by this time. One exception: the Kurdish parts of Ottoman Empire, and there the name Rum persisted down to the Republican times. I mean, down to the Republican.
To today.
Yes. There actually the name Rum persists for the Muslims, for the Turks actually.
For the Turks. For
yes.
members of the Turkish army in particular.
Yes.
Which is a very Roman kind of a thing, if you think about deep history. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Tom Gallant, at some point, when I think Virginia was asking her question, said, this is the main trend in contemporary Greek historiography. If he's here, could I ask which trend?
Bringing the Ottoman context in, perhaps? Was that what he meant? He's still here.
He's still here.
Nominally, he's still
but
here.
Maybe he's occupied with other things. I don't see any other questions, and I don't know how much time we're allowed, really. Baki, we certainly went over 90 minutes.
I can see Dorpen Kallenbach, so if he wants to comment.
Who, Tom?
You can see him. Yeah, I don't know if he's...
Sorry, I had to leave the room. So
I thought so, yeah.
I think something was said while I was away.
No, you were referring on the chat box. You referred to the main trend in contemporary Greek historiography. And since we lost that point with another discussion in the meantime, we want to turn to you and ask which trend you, which point of the conversation you made that intervention. Yeah.
Sure, to problematize and to reframe the way in which we talk about even the basic vocabulary, but how we talk about both pre-independence and particularly afterwards, introducing much more complexity into it, seeing it as an Ottoman story throughout. So the way we approach our students here is until 1923, Greek history is Ottoman history. Even after the foundation of the kingdom is still, what goes on in the kingdom is still dominated by what's, in many ways, by what's going on in Istanbul. And so you have to see them as imbricated stories. And so that's the main trend. That's what I was talking about in terms of the main trend. particularly with my spirit, 18th and 19th century, we're completely reframing the way in which we study those periods.
Outside of Greece, in Greece for official history, it
Well, what do
seems
you mean
like
by
the consensus is not quite there.
history? What do you mean by official history? Who's the official historians? I mean, there are some conservatives who had these debates going on throughout this year, but for the most part, no. That official history is now, it's those, but we're writing the national history. My book is the standard, it's taught, it's the standard text in high school now.
That's great.
So yeah, a new generation of kids are learning Greek history. They're learning the national narrative very differently than they did, than their parents did.
Could you maybe compare it to what's happening in this country? That there's also an agreement in the academy about a pretty fundamental revision to how we understand American history, but there are also elements in society that are very much opposed to that. So I think in Greece, it's a comparable situation, right?
Oh, absolutely. You have a spectrum, as you do here. I mean, and you do in Greece. You have some hardcore nationalists. I mean, you know, listen to the national heritage of the far right, and of course, it's completely different. But if you're talking about the major historians, both in the academy and those who have retired, you're talking about people who've actually reframed completely the way we write the national narrative.
Well, do they know Turkish?
Who are the most, just look at now who are the most prominent historians who've been featured in most of these events. And
do they know Turkish? Well,
some do.
Yeah, that's great.
And certainly
it's pretty recent. I didn't mean to say that nobody's done it. I meant to say that it's a very recent phenomenon. And we're talking about Ottoman studies in this event anyway, but yeah, it's definitely.
Well, look at the students who are some of them on here, like ITEC, who's already spoken, Dimitris Stereopoulos is right there as well. They're doing, Dimitris is studying the first constitution, Ottoman constitution.
That's great.
So those are the topics. That's where students are going. That's in fact where the academy's going.
That's great. I don't know if Ottoman studies, if you guys who are more ensconced in that feel that it's the same. I think you're saying it's earlier along the process of trying to synthesize, right?
Yes.
I
would say. I would say, but it's happening indeed.
Yeah. And we see it, and you know, we're all reading each other's works. So right there is we're seeing something quite different.
Yeah, I didn't mean to give a not
10 years
picture.
ago, would you have this even remotely similar profile of people we have now? I suspect not.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's arguing that, right? I think a lot is.
That's what, again, that's what
I'm
learning about. Languages. This is certainly pre-20th century historians. This is what the focus is.
Terrific. Great. And we have Nicholas Levis or Levi's. Sorry, I don't know how you pronounce it. This is why my course at Queen's College last year was called Modern Greece Transnational, and included a full reading of Professor Galant's History of the Greeks, as well as chapters from Professor Kasaba's work on the Ottoman economy and capitalism. We had a lot of talk of bourgeois and capitalism, by the way. I'm glad to hear that.
I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting that I'd be speaking. I was just commenting on what Professor Galant was saying, and I think his new textbook, or at this point it's 5-6 years old, is really very much in this trend. You know, I don't see how this history can be approached anymore in the academy outside of the transnational imbrigated reality. But otherwise, I didn't have any larger comment. This has been an amazing session. I really want to thank you all for it, and also the previous one.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to
thank. It's a hot day in New York today. Sorry.
Same in Boston, by the way. I would like to, and I get the report. Istanbul was pretty high today as well. For Hakan, it must have been a hot day.
Oh.
No.
Hakan is in an undisclosed location.
Hakan is cool. That's why.
It was close to 100 in Vermont, where I am, yesterday.
All right. I would like to end by thanking the panelists from the bottom of my heart. This really was 2 wonderful afternoons or evenings, one evening, one afternoon I spent with them discussing some of these matters, and it helped me a lot, and I'm sure others too, participating in our understanding, in our ways of thinking about the Greek Revolution and how that ought to figure in our narrative of Ottoman history, Ottoman historiography more broadly. So I thank Christine, Hakan, and Ioannis in reverse order of presentation this time, and to Baki, of course, who's disappeared somehow from my screen, but for making it possible, and to all the participants. Thank you very much. And hope we continue this conversation in some other form. Baki, I hope OTSA could, let's talk about this with some other colleagues, of course, a number of times, again, to figure out a way of making it a sustained historiographic conversation rather than one on this, one on that, which is also extremely useful and something we need to do in academia anyway, but to try and turn it into a sustained historiographic conversation about different communal histories in the empire, say, just for the sake of a short and quick way of putting it in words, though the wording could change, but something of that sort needs to be done. It needs to be done badly, I think, and the field would benefit. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank
you,
you,
Hocam.
Cemal.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to end by emphasizing, simply reminding everyone that our colleagues in Greece are indeed leading Ottoman studies. My dear friend Marino led a WhatsApp panel last month on geographies and histories of the Ottoman supernatural tradition, which actually was mostly focused on the Islamic tradition. This is what we are having, and next month, when we are going to be talking about Janissaries in Ottoman port cities, Muslim financial and political networks in the early modern Mediterranean, the chair will be, again, one of my younger colleagues from Crete. I don't know about other Greek locations, but in Rethymno, there is amazing contingent doing
things are changing.
Great work on Ottoman studies. And there is nothing like that, I must say, in Turkey. As in these posters, this center in Rethymno is providing an opportunity for Turkish scholars to provide their work for a larger audience. And here, again, in Marino's group, there are several scholars from Turkey, as well as Turkish-American scholars. In Turkey, I don't think we can talk and find something as similar. I think Christine's remarks are probably much more strongly valid for Turkey, where national historiography is so strong. I can imagine Tarih Vakfı, for instance, trying to do things. The Vakfı is very much in sort of an institution in that vein, but it's limited, and I don't think they're able to do European-wide events with the European Research Council things. Unfortunately, the situation is kind of uneven. There are Turkish scholars, many Turkish scholars who share this framework of vision, and yet in terms of organizing something that would include and sort of focus on Ottoman Balkans, Sabancı, of course, had several things, but it's not quite sustained, not quite long term, as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm wrong, which I tie to sort of the concerns of Turkish nationalism and the fate of, you can see this in the fate of the Greek community, that the Rooms, the descendants of Rum who continue to live in Turkey today, and then descendants of Ottoman Muslims who continue to live in Greece. If you compare the two communities, you'll see the community in Greece is not much smaller than it was, probably arguably bigger than it was in 1920s, whereas the community
twice the size
is basically disappearing, on which Christine is working now. And I hope we'll have a WhatsApp meeting in due course when Christine is ready to present her new work, on the history of the Greek community in Istanbul. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone.
Baki?
Yes.
I saw, Christine, are you on that round table about the end of empire at Mesa?
I think so. I'm on 2 different roundtables. I think that's one of them. have
The
to
one
look
that
back.
Milena Metodieva has.
Yes,
That also
yes.
will be a historiography question, roundtable, I presume.
perfect.
Now there we
Yeah,
go. Now we have a
great.
reference to follow on Mesa.
Yeah, we have momentum.
Thank you so much for
Thank you,
joining
Ginny.
us. Have a wonderful,
Baki.
wonderful day, and watch for our recording on YouTube. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.